This footage was never meant to be seen. A leaked video allegedly shows elite Delta Force operatives side by side with members of a powerful Mexican cartel. Did America's most secretive and lethal military unit train some of the most dangerous criminals in Mexico? Or is this just another internet hoax? Sit tight, because in today's video, we talk about the Delta Force's dark history with the cartels of Mexico and the implications of this on the U.S. war on drugs. Delta Force and cartel members. A wild new video has just surfaced, and it's sending shockwaves through the internet. It reportedly shows members of Delta Force, the elite U.S. military unit, rubbing shoulders with cartel operatives. And no, this isn't some deep fake or random conspiracy theory. This is real footage, and it's got people talking. For years, there have been whispers about secret ties between the U.S. Special Forces and Mexico's most ruthless drug cartels. The kind of stuff you'd hear in a movie: covert deals, backdoor alliances, and missions that never make the news. Officially, the U.S. has been waging war on these cartels for decades, even labeling them terrorist organizations. But what if behind closed doors, some of the very people sent to take them down were actually training them instead? That's exactly what some reports are suggesting. And the latest footage? It's adding fuel to a fire that's been burning for a long time. Remember Los Zetas? They were once the deadliest cartel in Mexico, responsible for beheadings, torture, and acts of violence that would make even the most hardened criminals flinch. But before they were cartel enforcers, they were something else. Elite Mexican soldiers trained by none other than the U.S. military. It all started with a group called GAFE, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, Mexico's airborne special forces. Back in the 90s, around 500 of these guys were trained by the U.S. Army's 7th Special Forces Group. At the time, this was part of Washington's broader strategy to combat drug trafficking and insurgencies in Latin America. These Mexican Special Forces soldiers were given cutting-edge military training in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and advanced warfare techniques, including weapons handling, map reading, and strategic communications. The goal? To create an elite force capable of taking down cartel operations. But what happened? Next was completely unexpected, and some would say catastrophic. As the corrupting power of cartel money grew, many of these highly trained operatives abandoned their posts and defected to the very organizations they were supposed to be fighting. One of the most infamous of these defectors was Arturo Guzman de Sena, also known as El Zeta Uno, Z1, who left the Mexican military in 1997 to work for the Gulf Cartel. He took his training, grabbed a few hundred other defectors, and became the enforcer for the Gulf Cartel. The consequences of this unintentional training program were devastating. With their U.S.-backed expertise, Los Zetas revolutionized cartel warfare, introducing advanced military tactics, heavy weaponry, and a level of organization never seen before in Mexico's underworld. They didn't just run drugs, they waged war. Beheadings, mass executions, and the systematic destruction of entire towns became their brutal trademarks. In a grim twist of fate, the very skills meant to dismantle criminal networks ended up strengthening them, making Los Zetas a force of unprecedented terror. Now, flash forward to today, and history seems to be repeating itself with CJ Yang. How do we know that? Well, on December 2nd, 2022, a bloodbath erupted in the Gulf of Mexico between two rival factions. One is an established cartel with deep drug trade connections, and the other is an up-and-coming, hyper-aggressive group with a terrifying advantage. Their core members are former Mexican Special Forces operatives. These guys are fighting with military precision, using tactics straight out of a special operations playbook. And it's no coincidence. This faction, known as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, doesn't operate like a street gang. It runs more like a paramilitary force. Think of it as a criminal version of the U.S. Special Operations Command. And here's where things get sketchy. There are strong allegations that this group was also trained by some of the world's most elite military units, like Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. But what exactly is this special unit that has been training all the wrong people? Officially, they're known as the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, 1st SFODD, and they're the absolute best of the best when it comes to counterterrorism, high-stakes hostage rescues, and top-secret missions that no one ever hears about. These guys don't just fight enemies, they dismantle entire networks. If there's anyone equipped to take down the cartels, it's them. However, some sources claim that instead of destroying these organizations, certain individuals within these elite forces may have actually helped build them up. How? Well, reports suggest that former Delta Force operators, working as private military contractors, may have provided training to several cartel gangs. Maybe they were acting independently. Maybe they had a green light from someone higher higher up. No one knows for sure, but what we do know for sure is that Zetas, CJNG, and several other Mexican cartels fight like a military unit, not a gang. They're using advanced ambush techniques, executing precision strikes, and moving in ways that look eerily similar to how U.S. Special Forces operate. And if you think this is a one-time thing, think again. There are several reports of American military training somehow accidentally ending up in cartel hands. A former cartel hitman straight up claimed in a 2019 interview that they were trained by U.S. Special Forces, including Delta Force. He didn't mince words. He said, there was a group of elite Marines, there were Navy from the United States, there were Delta Forces, there was everything there. Let that sink in. Again, when you consider the money aspect, you begin to agree with some of the stories flying around. I mean, the U.S. has poured more than $1.6 billion into Mexico under the Merida Initiative, supposedly to help fight the cartels. But instead of weakening them, it looks like some of that funding might have ended up fueling the very thing it was supposed to stop. All of these happenings point to a few possibilities. One theory is that rogue operators, former Delta Force or SEAL team members, went into the private sector and started training cartels for a hefty paycheck. Another possibility, some elements within the U.S. government knew exactly what was happening and looked the other way. Either way, it's a disaster. If these claims are true, the U.S. hasn't just failed to stop the cartels, it's helped them evolve into something even deadlier. And now, with this new video making waves, people are demanding answers. Was Delta Force actually involved with Zetas, the CJNE, and other Mexican cartels? Or is this all just another chapter in a long history of military interventions backfiring? One thing's for sure, this story isn't going away anytime soon. And the deeper you dig, the messier it gets. And whether intentional or not, the idea that Delta Force trained operatives are now leading some of Mexico's most violent cartels is alarming. But what's even more disturbing is the sheer scale of destruction these groups have unleashed. U.S.-trained terrorism? If you think you've heard of Ruthless, think again, because these Zetas cartel guys took brutality to a whole new level. The kind of violence they unleashed makes even the most hardened criminals look like amateurs. They weren't just ordinary gangsters who clawed their way up from the streets. Remember, many of them were actually elite soldiers trained by none other than the United States military. And let's be real, drug cartels aren't exactly known for playing nice, but even among them, the Zetas had a reputation for being on another level of viciousness. Other cartels even called them out for going too far. Imagine being so violent that even other drug lords think you're out of control. These guys operated with military precision and had no regard for the so-called gentleman's code of drug trafficking. In the old days, even cartels had rules. Certain people were off limits. But the Zetas didn't care if you were a rival, a civilian, or even a pregnant woman. If you were in their way, you were gone. And they didn't just kill people, they made statements. We're talking severed heads on display in city centers, execution videos posted online, and mass killings that shocked even seasoned cartel watchers. One of the most horrifying examples of their cruelty was the massacre of 72 migrants in Tamaulipas. These people weren't drug dealers, police officers, or rival cartel members. They were ordinary men and women, just trying to escape violence and find a better life. But to the Zetas, they were nothing more than disposable. When the migrants refused to work for them, the cartel executed every single one, leaving their bodies rotting in a pile. Even in a country used to cartel violence, this massacre shocked the world. But the Zetas didn't stop there. Their reign of terror stretches across Mexico. They've attacked buses full of passengers, forcing young men to fight to the death for their entertainment before killing the survivors. They've stormed universities, dragging students out of classrooms and executing them in broad daylight. Entire towns have been wiped out, their residents either murdered or forced to flee. And for those who stay, life is ruled by fear. Fear of being kidnapped, extorted, or killed for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The attack on Casino Royale on the 25th of August 2011 was another reminder of how deadly this cartel can be. It wasn't just a shootout between rival cartels. It was a massacre of innocent people, carried out in broad daylight. In Monterrey, Nuevo Leon, the Casino Royale was packed with customers, people enjoying their afternoon, completely unaware that death was about to walk through the doors. Then, a group of armed men stormed inside. They weren't there to rob the place or kidnap someone. They had one mission: to burn everything to the ground. Without warning, they doused the floors with gasoline, the fumes filling the air. Panic erupted as people realized what was happening. Some tried to run, some begged for their lives, but the gunmen didn't care. They lit the fire and walked away as the flames exploded, swallowing the casino in seconds. Thick black smoke filled the rooms, making it impossible to breathe. People rushed for the exits, but some of the doors had been locked. Trapped inside, dozens of victims were left to burn alive. Others died from the smoke, their bodies collapsing before they could make it out. By the time firefighters arrived, the damage was done. 52 people were dead. Fathers, mothers, workers, friends, all gone in a matter of minutes. And for what? Investigators later found out that the casino had been targeted because the owners refused to pay extortion money to the Zetas. That's all it took for the cartel to turn the place into a death trap. The attack sent a wave of fear through Monterrey. If the Zetas could massacre innocent people so easily, what chance did anyone have? Businesses that hadn't already been paying protection money now had no choice. Either hand over the cash or suffer the same fate as Casino Royale. After weeks of pressure, authorities finally made arrests. One of the key figures behind the attack was Carlos Oliva Castillo, known as the Frog, one of the highest-ranking leaders of the Zetas. Officials say he personally gave the order to burn the casino, proving once again that for the Zetas, human life meant nothing. When the army finally got their hands on him, they didn't just quietly take him in. They lined him up in front of the cameras at the Defense Ministry in Mexico City for the world to see. But his arrest didn't go unnoticed. The very next morning, chaos broke out in a prison near Monterrey. 60 inmates turned on each other with makeshift knives and set mattresses on fire. By the time it was over, 7 prisoners were dead, 4 were burned alive, and 3 were stabbed to death. Authorities believe it was a direct reaction to Castillo's capture, but the horror in Mexico didn't stop with Casino Royale. The Zetas weren't just killing to send a message anymore. They were committing acts of pure slaughter, and nothing made that clearer than what happened in Cadereyta, Nuevo León. It was the early hours of May 13, 2012, when authorities made a discovery that shocked even those used to cartel violence. 49 bodies were dumped along a highway leading to the U.S. border. Men and women, all of them brutally mutilated. But it wasn't just murder. It was something far worse. Every single victim had been decapitated. Their hands and feet had been cut off, making identification almost impossible. It was as if the Zetas wanted them to be erased from existence. A banner left at the scene made it clear. This was their doing. The cartel was taking credit for one of the worst massacres in Mexico's history, but the reason behind it, that remained a mystery. Were these victims rival cartel members, migrants trying to cross into the U.S., or just ordinary people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? No one knew for sure, and that made the massacre even more terrifying. Investigators believe the victims were killed somewhere else, their bodies stuffed into trucks and dumped along the highway like garbage. Some were wrapped in plastic bags, tossed aside as if their lives had meant nothing, and to the Zetas, they didn't. To them, this wasn't just about killing, it was about domination, about fear, about proving that no one could challenge them and live. For the people of Monterrey, the message was loud and clear. The Zetas controlled the roads, the cities, the entire region. They were ruthless, and they had no limits. If they could do this to 49 people and leave them in plain sight, what else were they capable of? This wasn't the first time the cartel had committed such an atrocity. Mass graves filled with migrants had been discovered before, bodies left to rot with no names, no justice. But this was something different. This was carnage on full display, meant to send a message to anyone who dared to stand in their way. And yet, even after this massacre, the violence didn't stop. Just weeks earlier, 23 bodies had been found in Nuevo Laredo, 14 of them decapitated. Their remained stuffed into ice boxes and dumped like trash. And before that, 18 bodies were found abandoned along a highway, their limbs scattered, their lives taken in the most brutal way possible. The Zetas didn't just kill people, they erased them, and they were theatrical in their brutality. They wanted their enemies to suffer, and they wanted the whole world to see it. Again, in May 2012, they put their cruelty on full display in Nuevo Laredo. 9 bodies were discovered hanging from an overpass, their lifeless forms swaying in the morning wind. 4 of them were women, their bodies covered in bruises, their faces wrapped in duct tape. The message was clear. This wasn't just a killing, it was a statement, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the Zetas' power. But that was just the beginning. Hours later, authorities found 14 human heads inside coolers, left outside City Hall. The rest of the bodies, stuffed into black plastic bags, crammed into a minivan abandoned near an international bridge. Once again, a banner was left behind, mocking the Zetas' rivals, boasting about the massacre. "This is how I will finish all the fools you send," it read. This wasn't the first time Nuevo Laredo had been turned into a war zone. The city had been at the center of cartel conflicts for years. This massacre was only proof that the war isn't ending anytime soon. The Zetas cartel had come to stay. They ruled through fear, and anyone who opposed them would meet the same fate as those hanging from the bridge. The people of Nuevo Laredo were trapped in the middle. Businesses were forced to pay protection fees or risk being burned to the ground. Families lived in fear, knowing that stepping out at the wrong time could mean never coming back. And the police? Either too scared to intervene or already in the pockets of the cartels. Even the federal government's attempts to control the situation had failed. Troops had been sent in before, but the violence only grew worse. The Zetas didn't just want control, they wanted to send a message. And as long as they continued to operate with impunity, that message was loud and clear. No one was safe. But here's the reality. Mexico's government has failed to stop them. The cartels are too powerful, too organized, and too ruthless. Some believe that only a force as elite as the Zetas themselves could take them down. A force like the U.S. Delta Force, one of the most highly trained special operations units in the world. Sending them in would be a bold move, but let's check out whether or not it's possible to have these guys fight the cartel. Possible or impossible? Republicans have been talking about the idea of sending the U.S. military to fight the cartel for years, but it's starting to sound a little risky, especially now that the cartels are no joke. They're not just running a few operations out of a basement anymore. They've got some serious military gear. We're talking armored vehicles, armed drones, and surface-to-air missiles. The cartels, especially groups like Los Zetas, the Sinaloa Cartel, and CJNG, have become pretty sophisticated, and some of them even got their training from Mexican soldiers who were taught by U.S. Special Ops. Delta Force going head-to-head with the cartels sounds thrilling, but here's the reality check. Let's slow down a little and really think about this. First off, let's talk numbers. Delta Force, the elite special ops team, is actually tiny. We're talking about a few hundred combat operators. Sure, they have support staff and all that, but the core, maybe 1,500 max. When you compare that to the cartels, who are a sprawling network, think hundreds of thousands of people, this isn't even close. Delta Force taking on the cartels in any significant way? Not happening. They're too small, too specialized for this level of large-scale operation. Now you may be thinking, but they're Delta Force. They can handle anything, right? Yes, on a small scale, absolutely. Delta's strength is in those high-profile raids. Think hostage rescues, targeting high-value individuals like an El Chapo figure. But that's still a very focused operation, not an all-out war against cartels. And that's where people get it wrong. If we did send in special ops, it wouldn't be like rolling into some random small town. The cartels aren't just hiding in plain sight. They know how to use the land to their advantage, and much like the Taliban, they can blend in with the local population. This isn't a clean, easy fight. It's a guerrilla war, and it would turn into something much bigger than anyone probably signed up for. So what about all those videos where people say Delta Force is going to smash the cartels? It sounds great, doesn't it? But let's get back to reality. This isn't a video game, and there's no just send in Delta. We're talking about a huge network of cartels with deep ties into Mexican law enforcement, the military, and politics. If Delta were to do anything, it'd have to be with a lot of intel from Mexico, something we don't just snap our fingers and get overnight. Here's the thing. Even though there's been talk of using the military more at the southern border, we're still talking about working with Mexico. This isn't an invade and fight situation. If we're talking action on the Mexican side, it's going to take time, maybe months or maybe even years. That's how long it'll take to build up relationships and get good intelligence on the ground. And let's not forget the corruption problem. The cartels don't just operate out of the shadows. They've got connections all the way up the chain, all the way to high levels of government. Tackling that is a massive undertaking. You can't just send in a surgical strike team and call it a day. This isn't just about busting a few bad guys. It's about taking on a network that's deeply embedded in society. No one, not even Delta Force, is suited for that kind of work. Now, this doesn't mean the military won't be involved. It just means the approach is going to look very different. In the short term, we'll likely see regular Army units and Marines taking a larger role, working on the border, dealing with smaller scale issues. As for Delta Force or other elite units like SEALs or Rangers, they'll be playing their part, but on a much smaller scale and for very specific targets, not as the ones leading the charge. Now, some folks point to the fight against ISIS as proof that U.S. Special Forces could do this in Mexico, but that's missing a big detail. In Syria and Iraq, there were other governments already involved in the fight against ISIS. In Mexico, the cartels operate almost like rogue states within the country, with the government struggling to rein them in. So if we take out a cartel leader, what's stopping another one from popping up? It's like playing a twisted game of whack-a-mole. If the US gets caught in this mess, we could end up just creating a whole new set of problems. Take Afghanistan, for example. The US spent years targeting Taliban leaders, but the underlying problems never got solved. The cartels would just keep filling the gaps, and the US could find itself stuck in a never-ending cycle of military action without getting to the real root of the issue. Sure, the cartels are dangerous. No one's denying that. But maybe, just maybe, the solution isn't about throwing more military might at the problem. It might be more about addressing the core issues like governance and corruption so that the cartels don't have the power to begin with. In the end, military action might look good on paper, but it doesn't always solve the deeper problems. Over the past year, many U.S. lawmakers and presidential candidates have suggested that the U.S. could start military operations in Mexico against drug cartels and their drug labs. labs. President Trump, for example, indicated in 2023 that if he were re-elected, he would consider military action in Mexico. Some members of Congress even proposed an authorization to use military force, AUMF, against cartels involved in fentanyl trafficking. But while the idea has generated significant debate, not much attention has been given to the legal questions that would come up if the U.S. decided to act without Mexico's consent. First, let's break down the international law side of things. The rules on when a state can use force in another country are pretty clear. It can happen if the UN Security Council approves it, if the other state agrees, or if the country is acting in self-defense. In this case, it's safe to say that the UN wouldn't authorize force against Mexican cartels, and Mexico is definitely not going to agree to foreign military intervention. Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has been firm in saying that the U.S. cannot intervene in their territory without violating Mexico's sovereignty. So the only remaining option is self-defense. This could be seen as a justification if the U.S. can argue that the cartels are directly threatening the U.S. in some way. The United States has long maintained that it can use force in another country if the government there is unwilling or unable to stop non-state actors, like drug cartels, from threatening the U.S. But there's no clear consensus on this, and some argue that such actions would violate international law. The U.S. could potentially justify using force in certain circumstances, like if cartel members attacked U.S. citizens or U.S. government buildings in Mexico. For example, if cartel members were to launch a grenade attack on a U.S. consulate or harm U.S. personnel, the U.S. would likely see this as an armed attack and could respond to defend its citizens. However, the U.S. would need to show that Mexico was either unable or unwilling to protect those citizens before acting. It would also need to ensure any response was proportional to the threat. On the other hand, using force in response to cartel violence that doesn't directly involve U.S. citizens or officials is a different story. For instance, if cartels attacked Mexican officials or citizens, it would be harder to justify U.S. intervention. The U.S. could argue that Mexico has failed to control the cartels, but this would face strong opposition under international law. Without Mexico's request, any U.S. military action in Mexico would be seen as a violation of Mexican sovereignty. Another argument put forward by those supporting military action in Mexico is the increasing flow of fentanyl into the U.S., which has caused thousands of deaths. Some have suggested that the U.S. could bomb drug labs or send special forces to capture cartel members. While this might sound appealing as a solution to the fentanyl crisis, it's hard to say if it would meet the criteria of an armed attack. While the cartel's actions undoubtedly cause harm, the U.S. would need to prove that the cartels are intentionally and directly attacking the U.S., not just engaging in a criminal enterprise that leads to harmful consequences. Using military force against Mexican cartels without the Mexican government's consent presents major legal challenges. It would be tough to defend under international law, and even if the U.S. could justify some actions under the self-defense argument, it would have to tread carefully to avoid violating Mexico's sovereignty and international norms. And with that, we've come to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed this video, just click on any of the cards showing on your screen to watch more content like this.